Hey, how's it going guys? Welcome back, and in this episode we're going to be adding the shooting mechanics, and we're going to be making it so that when the bullets are shot, they're going to automatically pick the closest enemy, and then they're going to attack it. So let's just get straight to it. Alright guys, so the first thing you need to do is just create a new layout, right click new layout, and this is going to be the object repository where we're going to store our particles and things like that. So we're going to right click, insert a new object, we want a 3D shape, and then this 3D shape, we don't need to show any of its faces, as this is just going to basically reference the bullet. And then we're going to add an additional object, which is going to be the visuals for the bullet. We can call this bullet, and then we just need to head over to behaviors, and we're going to give this a bullet behavior. And then we also just want to give it outside of layout, destroy it. So we want to give it a destroy outside of layout. We can keep the speed at 400 and just set the acceleration to 2000. We don't want to set the angle, and we want to turn step on. Alright, so that's it for that. And then insert a new object, 3D again. And then this is going to be the visuals for the bullet. So this is where you want to just for now, either just some placeholder, or here you want to, instead of each of these faces, you want to put the actual design for your bullet. Alternatively, you could just use a 2D sprite. It's up to you. Alright, great. So once you're happy with your design, we can select these, and we can just make these a little smaller. With them only being bullets, we don't need them to be that large, and also it's better for performance if they're smaller. So we can set this to something like 10, and then the height we can just set to 2. We can do the same with the actual reference object. We can just set that to 2. And then the size we could just set to like 30 by 30, something like that. So basically, we're going to use this bullet, and then this is the visual that's going to spawn on that. The reason we're using it separate is because we're also going to attach a different object to this here. So we can call this the bullet visual, and then we're going to add a behavior, and we just want to give this the tween behavior. We're going to be using the tween to basically add a trail effect, and also to make sure it destroys itself, so that it doesn't just scale out to be like a big line. Alright, great. So once you've done that, head over to your event sheet, and we need to just add 3 global variables. So we're going to right click, insert a variable, and then we want to add a distance to player. We want to add another one called closest distance, and then finally we want to add one that's closest enemy. Once you've done that, we can set the closest distance to a high number, like 6 nines. Alright, great, so you should have something that looks like that, and then we'll be using this shortly in a moment. Also, one quick thing I'll just add is if, I forgot to mention this in the previous episode, on your every tick event, if you add an event here where if you set the player billboard, and you set the width to this right here, if you just copy this to sign mousex-player billboard.x, times it by 128, so that's basically the height, and then what this does is this is just going to make it so that the actual image of your player will flip based on where your cursor is. So that's if you want it to flip with that. Alright, great. Anyway, so what we'll do is we're going to right click, we're going to add a group, and we'll just call this bullets, something like that. And then we want to add an event, and we're going to say system, every X seconds. I'm going to set this to 0.6. So you can set this to whatever you'd like. This is how often you want to actually fire a bullet. Then what we want to do is we want to add an event, system, we'll just create object. We're going to create the bullet, set a layer to your game layer. And then the X and Y, we want to set this to basically the player's position. And then the X and Y, we want to set it to a player's position, but we also want to make sure we take into consideration the angle. So to do this, we're going to say player collision dot X, and then we're going to say plus cos. We want to add some brackets, and we want to say player collision dot shooting angle, like this. If you've not been following the series, I'd suggest either going back, or otherwise this right here, you need to add an additional variable to your player, and that is the shooting angle. We can copy this, paste in the Y, and for the cos we just need to set that to sine, and then we need to set this to Y, like this. Next, let's just get the loop out of the way. So what we need to do is we need to set up a loop so that we can determine which is the closest enemy, so then we know which one to fire towards. So to do this, we're going to add an event, we're going to say system, we're going to say for each, and this is where you're going to enter your enemy. So for now I just have an enemy tomato, and we just want to set system, we want to set value, we want to set distance to player, and then here we want to put distance, we're going to add some brackets, then we want to use player billboard.x, comma player billboard.y, comma, and then this is where we're putting out your enemy. So this for me it'd be enemy tomato.x and enemy tomato.y. Next, right click on here, and we're going to add 2 blank sub events. So we can just copy and paste this one. And this is where we're just going to add our checks for the enemy, and then to actually fire the bullets towards the closest enemy. So inside of here we can select system, we can compare 2 values, and then we just compare the distance to player we added at the top, and we just want to check if this is less than the closest distance. So once again we're going to add an action, system, set value, closest distance, and then we'll say distance to player, like this. And then we'll set the closest enemy. So to do this, once again, we'll go system, set value. This time select closest enemy, and then what we want to do is we want to set the UID of the enemy. So we want to say enemy tomato, or whatever you've called your enemy, and we'll put .UID. And this is just a unique value that's attached to every instance of an enemy. So if you had 10 enemies, they would all have a different ID. So finally, we want to add the check of if that UID is the closest enemy, then we're going to then set that to be the enemy that we're targeting. So once again, we want to compare two values. So system, compare two values. So we're just going to say enemy tomato, or whatever you've called it. So enemy tomato .UID, and it would say is it equal to closest enemy, like that. So now from this, we can now actually set the angle of the bullet. So we can add an action. We can set the bullet, set angle of motion, and then what we want to do is we want to type angle, add some brackets, and then just like we did for the distance to the player, we can say player billboard .x, player billboard .y. We can say enemy .x, and then enemy .y. Oh, sorry, actually we should set this to the player collision, not the billboard. So we say player collision, and just change this one here as well, collision. So it should look something like this. So now let's just tell the game what to do when an enemy is destroyed. So we can add an event. We can say enemy, or we have to just say on destroyed. We can copy this here, and we can just paste this in the on destroyed. And then we can also just copy these two values. And then all we want to do is we want to reset these values. So the closest distance, we can just set that to a high number, like 999. And then for the closest enemy, we can just set that to 0. And then for this, we just actually want to make sure this is a separate event. So we could even just copy this here with the angle one. We can drag this in. We can delete that. And we can just drag these down into here like this. Okay, so that's the logic done for the bullet. We can copy these two events here, and we can just place these in the bullet just to keep it separate. And then what we can do is we could add another subgroup, and we can just call this visuals for now. Alright, great, so once you've done this, let's actually set up spawning these bullets. So what we can do is we can add an event. We can say system, and we can say every X seconds. And this we want a low number, so we want to do something like 0.025. And then we want to add another check, so we can add another condition. We want to system, we can compare two values again, and we want to check if the bullet dot count is greater than 0. So if the bullet count is greater than 0, every 0.025 seconds, we can then spawn a bullet. But before we do this, we need to add another loop, and then we need to iterate through each instance of the bullet. So what we can do is we can right click, add a blank sub event, and then inside of here we can say system for each bullet, and then we can add an action, and we can say system create object. This time we want to spawn the bullet visual on the game layer, and then we just want to set this X and Y to the actual bullet, so we can just say bullet.x and bullet.y like this. Add another event, and then we can say visual, and then we can just set the Z elevation also, and we can just set this to the bullet.z elevation, and that's just to make sure I'm the same height. Add another event, visual again, and then this time I want to set the size. I want to set the size to bullet.width -1, and then divide it by 100,000, or just 1 and 5 zeros. And we can just copy this, and we can just do the same in the height, except we just need to replace this with height. Like this. And then the last thing we need to do for this visual is we just need to set up the tween behavior we added. So add an action, visual again, and then we want to tween. So we've searched tween, we want to use tween 2 properties. We can just call this destroy, something like that. We want to set the size, X and Y is fine on 0, time should be 0.1. We can keep ease on default. We want to set the destroy and complete to true. And then we don't want to loop, this can be the same, and we also can keep it repeating once. That's fine. Alright, great, that should all work now. The only thing we need to do next is we just need to make it so that when a bullet actually hits an enemy, we need to actually deal the damage and then destroy them once their health is at 0. So this is really simple to do. All we have to do is add an event. We can say bullet on collision with, select your enemy, and so when it collides, we can then say bullet destroy, and then we want to add another action, and we want to say enemy subtract from. we want to subtract from our health, and we want to subtract player billboard dot damage. So we want to subtract the actual damage amount to the health. Okay, great, so that should work now. All we need to do lastly is we just need to add a condition to say if it's 0, we want to destroy the enemy. So we can add another sub-event, we can select the enemy, we can compare the instance variable, and we can say if the health is less or equal to 0, and then we can just add an action and we can say enemy destroy. One final note is just make sure, so if you select your player billboard, you just want to make sure you've actually set your damage variable. So for example, this is 25. And then also just make sure on your actual enemy, you just want to make sure that the health is set as well. Okay, so let's test this. So as you can see, the bullets are now firing towards the enemy. They're firing towards the closest enemy. So if I move, it'll switch up to the closest enemy. And then once the health is taken, as you can see, it destroys them. Alright, great. So that's it for this one, guys. This is a simplified way of doing this system. These systems can get quite complex, so I'm trying to make sure I keep this as simple as possible, and then we can build on this in the future. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys.